Now, you heard that review of what's going on. And I've talked a lot about how complex this particular site is several times, and I referred to a lot of the boring tests. But I don't know anything next to this gentleman here, right? Dr. Young has shown me things about this river, the lake, and so on that I've been totally amazed at. And I'm going to give all of you that opportunity now to learn from Dr. Young what are some of the things that I've learned. And I'm sure you'll find it very interesting. Dr. Young.
All right, thank you. Is that about loud enough in the back?
No, a little more.
More?
More.
Okay. All right, well, when I started and first talked to Bill about that, I didn't really know much about the project. I worked in Monroe County for the EMC and the health department for 30 plus years, but on lots of different projects on mostly landfill sites. But what I'm hoping to do here is just tell you about the geology of the site and draw a few conclusions. And rather than just tell you what the geology is, I basically want to try to convince you that we know how it got the way it is, because it's all buried and it's not obvious from the surface. So I assume I don't need to explain where the site is. This is a somewhat older picture, and you probably have all looked at the plans for the site, but the construction as it's been going on, these are some of Bill's views of the excavation for the Marina looking north, a little bit northeast towards the old ferry buildings, and to the south to show the project to this point in time. There was something about the front lights going out. Can we get the front lights out, or is that not possible?
Can you get the lights on the front?
Where are they?
Yes.
There we go.
Okay, so a lot has been going on here. I haven't been a party to most of that, but what I want to talk about is the history of Lake Ontario. Basically, it's a glacial history. The lake was more than 400 feet below its present level about 12,000 years ago. So if you were walking down to the beach, you'd have to walk a long distance to the north to get down to where the lake was. Since that time, Lake Ontario's acted like a bathtub that's being rotated with the Canadian side going up and our side going down. So what we have on this side of the lake is all the drowned estuaries, or bays as we call them, like Irondequoit Bay being the biggest, but all the others are equally interesting, and they're all the mouths of drowned rivers that used to flow into the lake when it was at this much lower level. So all the places that you are familiar with along the lake are drowned river valleys, and drowned by several hundred feet. Now, why that's the case shows when the ice was retreating about, say, 12,000 years ago, maybe a little less. At that time, the weight of the ice sheet pushed down the Earth's crust, and it did so by several hundred feet. So as a result, the St. Lawrence River, no, I can't see my pointer. The St. Lawrence River, which I guess you can see there in Lake Ontario, that was not the lowest point. The lowest point was the Ottawa River further north. So as the ice melted, not all the Great Lakes were full of water. You can see Superior there. And off to the west, another lake called Lake Agassiz, which was bigger than all the other lakes put together. So the water went across the route north of where it goes today. And therefore, Lake Ontario was not receiving water from Lake Erie. And there was no Niagara Falls. So slowly the ice moved back. Some of the lakes were full of water, some weren't. But again, the main outlet for the meltwater was the one shown there in red, the main outlet as the ice melted north. And that's simply because the Earth's crust is rigid, but the stuff underneath it is a little bit more like molasses, maybe not quite that weak, but a semi-plastic mantle material. So that pushes down, just like if you push your hand on your mattress and then let go and it comes back up again. But the ice pushed the Earth down and it's still rising. A lot slower than it was 10,000 years ago, but it is still rising. This is how far we know it absolutely has risen. Up at the top, you would be in the Hudson Bay area, and I think you recognize the Great Lakes. So there were 600 meters, which is almost 2,000 feet of uplift in that area after the ice pushed the earth down, it popped up again 2,000 feet. But when you get down to the area of Lake Erie, you can see it's about 128 meters on the north side, and near Buffalo it's about 43 meters. So if, I thought I had a number in there, but anyway, say 43, so it's about 80 meters, 250 feet or so across Lake Erie. In other words, it was tilted like a big bathtub. Now today that's still going on. These are the current figures that we can measure in the last 100 years. The north side and the Ogdensburg area is rising relative to Buffalo by about 1 foot per century. And that's still happening today. That's measurable change that the earth is still responding to the weight of the ice. So another way to look at it would be, imagine a bathtub on a spit, which would be this red line, and as you rotate the bathtub, everything on the Mexico Bay side goes up and everything on the Rochester side goes down. That's why we're drowning all our rivers. And the Thousand Islands, on the other hand, they have just come out of the water in the last 10,000 years. They weren't there before. So that goes up, Canada goes up, we go down. So as a result, again, we have all these nice bays that you're familiar with, some of the recreational areas, and the sandbars that border them on the lakeside. So there's a constant movement of sand building up and being pushed toward the land. And of course, the sediment coming down the Genesee River. So there's also longshore transport. Most of the transport along this part of the lake is from the west to the east. So the sands, anytime you put a barrier in the way like the Genesee River, it grinds. Everything tends to pile up on the west side as it's moving toward the east. And there's a lot of sediment, of course, coming out down the river. And that's been true for the last 14,000 years or so since the ice melted here. So if we went back to the days when there was no community here and just tried to imagine what this looked like, it would have been a big delta feature like this with a lot of sediment being dumped into the lake, and that would slowly change over time, and the lake would be rising. So we start about 12,500 years ago when it's 465 feet lower. The Genesee River, you can see, is separated from that water level by quite a distance. Probably looks like 10 or 15 kilometers, so maybe 10 miles or so. You'd have to walk further to get to the lake in those days, as well as going downhill. So at that time, the river wasn't in its present position in its entirety. It was trying to cut down to this lake level, and it had several thousand years to do that. So there would have been lots of waterfalls every time there was a hard layer of rock. You would have seen things like this in those days as the river was trying to cut downwards. So I tried to find a picture of what it probably looked like when it was all finished, and this went on for roughly 5,000 years. When it was all finished, this is what it would have looked like, approximately. A big gorge with a really low lake. And what's happened since then is the lake has actually risen because of this tilting effect. So all of this land that you can see in the picture where it says glacial till, all of that was filled in over this period of time. So when we get to today, but before humans arrived on the scene, you'd probably have something like this. That gorge that we saw here would all be filled in and buried as the lake came up. All that sediment would have been dumped in from the longshore transport and also the river sediment. So in most deltas, if you visit them today, a floodplain or a delta, it's pretty flat, it's very muddy. If you try to walk through it, you sink into the mud. And that's the kind of situation that we have out here at the end of the river. Now, underneath all that is the last glacial deposit. We call it glacial till, but glacial till is usually considered to be a hard, compact material. It's okay for construction, but it's a little more complicated than that, and I'll get into that later. But I guess the light in here is a bit bright, but that is what glacial till normally looks like. Lots of stones in it and clay, normally deposited at the base underneath the glacier, so it's really compacted. The other kind of sediment is river sediment, like we see in the Genesee River. It's pretty fine. It's fine silt and sand in most cases, particularly down at this end of the river. And of course, during the spring, there's a lot of change in the river banks. There's also a lot of fine sediment in this area that was left in the glacial lakes, like Lake Iroquois that you may have heard of, that was here before the ice melted completely. And that sediment, if you look at it in road cuts and gravel pits and other places, you can see very easily that it's twisted and contorted because it just slid around all over the place. It's not like the bedrock that we stand on in most places. River floodplains are notoriously subject to slumping failures like this over time. So that's a common situation in the Genesee River as well. Lots of landslides, especially down near Geneseo. Both sides of Irondequoit Bay are full of these old lake sediments that were deposited not as the lake was rising, but as the glacier was very close to the city in terms of its location. Now, the other factor relating to these kinds of sediments that I want to concentrate on is called liquefaction. This is what happens to these kinds of sediments when they are disturbed. And when they were drilling a lot of the boreholes out here for the Marina, in some cases it says WOR on the boring logs. WOR means the weight of the rods. In other words, when they were drilling, all they had to do was put the rods in the hole and they would sink of their own weight, and that's how they got their samples. That's kind of unusual, but liquefaction you often hear about on the news because it's something that usually happens during strong shaking during an earthquake, like in Christchurch in the recent past in New Zealand. And basically you get all these little sand volcanoes because this soft material gets liquefied and squirts up through the air and forms little sand volcanoes. And this is a gravel pit just west of here where you can see the same kinds of structures that formed during the time the glacier was here. You can see the sediment is not in nice horizontal layers, and you can see the upward motion of the fine material. And here's another case near an earthquake site where the gray layers with the arrows indicate how the sand was forced up to the surface. But basically the ground sinks, the sand comes up to the surface, but the ground overall sinks as a result. And this is typical of what happens in cases where this kind of sediment is shocked. And it can be an earthquake, it can be construction equipment. I'll go over a case recently I was involved in last month. But essentially the structures at the surface either sink or collapse or in some cases tip over. Subsidence is very common in these kinds of situations. I think this was the Mexico City earthquake quite a few years ago. So if we go back to what happened on Lake Ontario, we're going to start out with the lake roughly 465 feet lower, and it's slowly going to rise over 12,000 years or so to get up where we are today. And here's the actual data published by Canadians and with some of my own data included. This is a paper that is available in the literature from about 2 years ago. So the line shows how the lake has behaved. Over on the right is the past, about 14,000 years ago at the bottom scale. So it was up, and when it was up, that created, I'm going to go back here. When it was up at the top on the right, the red line, that was when the shoreline of Lake Iroquois was formed. That's Ridge Road, as most of you may have heard, which is about 430 feet. The lake today is around 245, I believe, and Ridge Road is about 430 something. So there was a lake here, covered all of the city of Rochester. And that's because the ice sheet blocked the St. Lawrence Valley, and we had a lake called Lake Iroquois, and if you look north, you would have seen the glacier facing us. All right, when that melted and backed off the Adirondacks, the whole thing dropped down to the red line at the lowest point, which you can see 220 feet below sea level. And then it slowly has come up since the past. So that's the actual radiocarbon data that we can prove that the lake has gone through this history. So Rochester was there. Slowly the Genesee River got flooded. And the change in 12,500 years is this 465 feet. So all this loose sediment that hasn't been compacted, it's just shoreline sediment, river sediment, all being packed in there, marshland. So what I've done is taken the data that Bill talked about, which is all in the form of books with boring logs telling you what they found at certain levels. But unless you're a geologist or an engineer, it's kind of hard to put that all together. So I've made some maps of the area. This is a reasonable approximation of what we can infer from these boring logs. So the yellow lines here show you the shape of the surface today, 245 being the Genesee River elevation on the lake. And then the yellow lines climb up to 270 feet on the north side. And I kind of put in where the first building is proposed to be built. So that's the surface. But if we look under that, we see this old surface that was carved when the river was trying to cut down those 460 some feet. And what you see, there's a tributary coming in from the north. Elevations in this bottom part of the map are around 100 feet. That's relative to sea level. So bedrock is about 145 feet below the river level at that particular location. The ferry terminal is built over sediment that's about 100 feet thick, and most of it's pretty soft. I don't know anything about their foundation design. Now, if you add to that the thickness of all this really fine sediment that could be subject to liquefaction, this is what it looks like. The yellow colors show in a broad generalized way, because we don't have perfect data. At the top edge, the soft sediment is about 20 feet thick under the buildings. In the middle is 30 to 50 feet thick where the marina proper is. And down on the bottom part, you can see it's 100 feet thick. That's an awful lot of fine, unconsolidated or uncompacted sediment. If I add to that where the glacial till is, I put the green line on there. North of there, the till is about 30 feet deep. South of there, it's more than 30 feet deep. And at the bottom, there isn't any. You go right into bedrock in places without any glacial till. So lots of soft sediment. It varies a little bit. And in this case, I'm showing a couple of cross sections. I've added in blue the actual marina water area that's partially under construction. But you can see the 10-story building, and it's got two lines, A3, A4, and A1 and A4. Those are directly off the contract documents. And they look like this. This is the A4, A3, which is the north-south line. Right, and it shows you the yellow is the area of this fine silty material. And the blue line shows you the groundwater level, which, of course, the sediment has to have water in it before it behaves like this. So it's kind of a perfect situation to develop liquefaction. And then the east-west line in the same area, the part of the building that would be closest to the ferry terminal. This is what that looks like. Again, it's not only silt, but it's organic. That's even worse, because organic material is highly compressible. You know, basically an old swamp land. So if you put all of that together, unfortunately, the purple line shows you where we have very little data. Inside that purple line, there's hardly any information all the way to bedrock, only two borings that I've indicated with the little purple dots. So I put together as best I can what a geologist would envision if they looked at all the data, but it's not perfect. But it must be a reasonable approximation of what's going on. So, I have trouble reading this myself. So the Genesee River region is underlain by thick, loosely consolidated sediments deposited at the interface of a rising lake. The lake's sediments and peat are interbedded with river and delta sediments from the Genesee River, and sediment thickness is highly variable. They fill a deep 100-foot gorge, poorly defined and eroded when the lake was way down 7,000 to 12,000 years ago. This poorly consolidated sediment is 30 to 100 feet thick under much of the site, and it rests on eroded glacial till or bedrock. Bedrock depth is very variable because of the shape of that old gorge. These uncompacted sediments are among the types of loose deposits that are subject to liquefaction and similar types of failures when disturbed by shaking, including vibratory compaction of heavy construction equipment, which is what is proposed in this situation. So my issues would be, will the foundations for the heavy structures be supported by deep piles or equivalent support? I don't really know what the plans are. What effects will construction activities, including heavy vibratory compaction equipment, have on existing surface fine-grained sediments or loosely consolidated lake and river sediments? Will the future construction have damaging impacts on existing or nearby structures located on the same loosely consolidated sediments? And lastly, how stable will the new marina banks be over the long term, including the effects of fluctuating lake levels? So I have also an example from a case where a distant relative of mine in Rhode Island recently had their house destroyed by this process. Essentially, this is the situation. The home is up on the top left of the diagram, and the school in Rhode Island was in the lower right. And they started to add an addition to the school, and all they did is run compaction equipment to try to compact the soil. And because of the situation underneath, which I think is the next slide, yeah, this was the situation underneath. The school was on the right. The gray band is this loose sediment, just like we have here. So the school was on fairly thin material, but over on the house on the right, on the left, about 500 feet away, there was much thicker sediment and the same kind of situations. When they drilled into it, all it took was the weight of the drilling tools to penetrate the material. But as a result, when they started running the heavy compaction equipment across the surface, the chandelier in the living room was going like this, 500 feet away. And this is what happened in the backyard. It just sank about 18 inches. Leading up to the swimming pool, the house tilted, so trouble shutting doors and windows. The house wasn't destroyed, it just made it hard to live in. The wall of the swimming pool sank. The back porch sank also. Okay, and basically you're talking about the same situation here. Only here, this material is even thicker. So it's not only the foundation, but if you already have a building there and you're running heavy equipment, construction equipment, it's possible that it could affect other buildings that have already been built in the past. Of course, the only way around it is really to anchor everything all the way down to bedrock. That would be reasonably safe, but that's, in some cases, almost 100 feet near the old ferry anyway. So that's the situation in terms of where these sediments are. They're 20 feet thick at the north. That's certainly plenty of sediment to cause liquefaction. If we go back to the case in Rhode Island here, see the thickness of these sediments was only 20 feet, approximately on the left-hand side. So it's a subtle effect, and you don't hear about it very much. Sometimes it happens in places where there are no structures, so it's hard to measure. But the other thing I wanted to bring up is about glacial tills. Often you see on construction reports that it's glacial till, so it's okay to use that as a foundation. But in a real glacier, what happens is it's not just the material under the ice that gets the full weight of the ice. When you get to the edge of a glacier, it's usually covered with a lot of dirt like you see here, and that stuff slides off with a lot of water content. They're called flow tills, and they look like regular tills. But as you can see in this diagram, some of the stuff is under the glacier, but a lot of it labeled as FL. That just slides off the ice. So it's soft, it's mushy. If you waded through it, you'd sink up to your knees, or maybe even more than that. So just because they say it's glacial till doesn't mean it's a really compact, hard material. It probably has stones in it, and often that's why it's hard to drill through. So it may appear to be hard because of the stones that are in it, but it's not necessarily a compacted material. So, and one of the reasons for that is in glaciers near the end, you can see a person there for scale. When a glacier comes down to the end, it's very brittle. It's kind of soft back where it's thick, but as it gets thinner, it gets brittle. So as the ice moves, it forms little thrust planes like this, and all the dirt comes up to the surface. So that's why it ends up being very dirty at the end of the glacier. So you have a very complicated environment. That was true here as the ice backed off, and we got all this stuff dumped into the former channel of the Genesee River, and then all that lake sediment coming and filling it up on top of that. So these flow tills, just because they are tills doesn't mean they're good building foundations. So that's my geologic story.